On November 16, 1951, as the fog receded from Portsmouth Harbor, Captain Dennis Campbell ascended the gangway of HMS Illustrious. He carried in his briefcase a document of profound, if deceptive, simplicity, a diagram of flight deck angled a mere 10 degrees to port. This simple sketch, however, held the potential to save more naval aviators than any advancement in weaponry. But the future was unknown. The present was terrifyingly clear. Campbell knew the Royal Navy's grim calculus. In the preceding 12 months, landing accidents had destroyed 43 aircraft and claimed the lives of 17 pilots. Every one of these losses occurred in the final, desperate 30 seconds of flight, when a 30-ton jet at 140 miles per hour had to snag a wire on a heaving deck, with a steel barricade waiting just 60 feet beyond to obliterate any margin of error. The crisis was global. The United States Navy faced an even greater catastrophe, recording 776 Class A mishaps in 1951 alone, more than 2 lost aircraft or dead airmen per day in peacetime. The Korean War only amplified the carnage, with USS Boxer reporting 7 barrier crashes in a single deployment and USS Princeton losing 9 aircraft in 4 weeks. On the era's straight-deck carriers, the physics were unforgiving. Missing the arresting wires meant a pilot either slammed into barricade at full throttle or plowed into the tightly packed aircraft parked forward, creating a fireball that could incinerate a dozen men instantly. The jet age, with aircraft like the F-9F Panther landing 40 knots faster than their propeller-driven predecessors, had outpaced the technology of the carriers themselves. A jet engine 7-second spool-up time was an eternity for a pilot sinking toward the sea. From the carrier's port quarter, landing signal officers waved their paddles, but their frantic signals were often rendered moot. By the time a pilot recognized his error, his fate was already sealed by physics. Every senior officer and engineer knew carrier aviation had reached its breaking point. This deadly paradox, a future dependent on jets and a present where those jets were killing their pilots, had its origins in 1945, the moment Lieutenant Commander William P. Rye made the first jet landing aboard USS Wake Island. What Campbell couldn't yet know was that a solution would be dismissed as impossible by the very experts tasked with solving the problem, and that saving carrier aviation would depend not on a committee, but on one man's refusal to accept that a fundamental design flaw should be a death sentence. By 1950, a crisis was brewing on the flight decks of the world's major navies. The jet engine had revolutionized aerial combat, granting unprecedented speed and altitude, but it also introduced a fatal paradox for carrier operations. The slow throttle response of these new power plants created a deadly trap. Unlike propeller aircraft, whose pilots could cut power on signal and drop onto the deck, jet aviators had to approach with their engines spooled high. They landed power on, maintaining thrust until the wheels were down, a crucial but perilous technique, ensuring they had enough energy to climb away if they missed the arresting gear, as their engines took far too long to accelerate from idle. This necessity created a harrowing final approach. A pilot was committed, hurtling toward a narrow 60-foot landing zone containing just 4 arresting wires. Immediately beyond lay the last line of defense, the crash barricade, a heavy web of steel cables. And just beyond that, a lethal landscape of parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and ammunition carts. The physics were unforgiving. An F-9F Panther landing at 125 knots was covering 211 feet every second. If its tailhook missed all 4 wires, the pilot had a mere 2.1 seconds before impact with the barricade. When that barricade failed, 30 tons of jet fuel and ordnance plowed into forward aircraft park at over 100 miles per hour. In March 1951, Captain Bruce Williams, the air operations officer aboard USS Kearsarge, witnessed this horror firsthand. An accident report starkly noted the sequence. Aircraft struck barrier at full power. Barriers separated. Aircraft continued forward into 6 parked Corsairs. The resulting fire reached aviation gasoline stores, ultimately destroying 14 aircraft, killing 11 men, and injuring 23 more. In the aftermath, navies focused on a seemingly logical solution: stronger barriers. The British developed a flex deck, a rubberized surface for gear-up landings, which test pilot Eric Brown officially called fundamentally sound but privately bloody terrifying. The U.S. Bureau of Aeronautics spent $3.2 million on the Davis barrier, a web designed to stop a 25,000-pound aircraft at full throttle. But these were merely stronger cages. They didn't prevent accidents. They only hoped to contain them. Senior aviators knew the real problem, as men like Captain William T. Razier, head of aviation military characteristics, began to argue was the flight deck itself. In June 1945, a report on naval operations laid bare a looming crisis. Current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics. The operational reality was stark. The world's aircraft carriers, designed in 1942 for propeller aircraft that landed at 70 knots, were now faced with 1952-era jets approaching at 130 knots, with no ability to abort a landing at the last second. As the accident rate climbed, a desperate international search for a solution yielded only a litany of failures. The British experimented with flexible rubber decks, the Americans with ever stronger barriers, and the French with reducing aircraft weight. Nothing worked. The problem seemed unsolvable because it was rooted in an assumption no one dared to question, that a carrier's landing area must run parallel to its central axis. The moment required a man like Captain Dennis Campbell. Born in 1907 and entering the Royal Navy in 1925, Dennis Royal Farson Campbell was a pilot, not an engineer. He had qualified in 1931, early enough to have flown fabric biplanes, yet late enough to grasp that naval aviation was a deadly serious profession demanding engineering precision. During the Second World War, he flew the obsolete Fairey Swordfish torpedo bomber, the very aircraft that had famously crippled the German battleship Bismarck, earning him the Distinguished Service Cross. Yet after the war, he was a bureaucrat, assigned a desk at the Ministry of Supply. With no advanced degrees, his job was a routine of paperwork and meetings. But Campbell possessed a quality no credential could confer, an unshakable refusal to accept the deaths of his fellow pilots. In 1951, that conviction was brought into sharp focus. He attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a 23-year-old test pilot and Campbell's former student. During a landing on HMS Implacable, Lithgow had flown a perfect approach, but his jet floated just 6 feet too far, missing the arrestor wires. The safety barricade failed, and the aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Standing at that graveside, Campbell turned to his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, his resolve hardened by grief. "This is insane," he stated. "We're murdering them with our own equipment. A pilot does everything right and still dies because 60 feet isn't enough margin for error. There has to be another way." Unmoved by the platitudes offered at pilots' funerals, Captain Dennis Campbell remained fixated on the problem. He immersed himself in the grim calculus of carrier accidents, pulling reports, interviewing landing signal officers, and studying approach patterns. Campbell was not a trained engineer, so he relied on the universal language of visualization. On a train journey from Portsmouth to London, the solution materialized in his notebook. He sketched the familiar outline of a carrier deck, wrestling with the physical constraints of the vessel. If the landing area couldn't be made longer, and the ship's beam prevented it from being wider, then the only remaining option was to reorient it. He angled the runway, canting the landing strip 10 degrees to port. The insight was staggering in its simplicity. With this change, the landing zone no longer terminated in a steel barricade and a deck crowded with parked aircraft. It now ended in open ocean. A pilot who missed the arresting wires could simply apply full power, climb away, and circle around for another attempt. There would be no catastrophic collision, only air, water, and an invaluable gift of a second chance. The idea was so elemental it felt almost foolish, leaving Campbell to wonder if he had achieved a moment of brilliance or merely overlooked a fundamental flaw known to every credentialed engineer. On August 7, 1951, he would find out. Convening a meeting at the Ministry of Supply, he faced an assembly of the Naval Aviation Establishment. Louis Boddington, Director of the Naval Air Department at Farnborough, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, and a panel of 6 senior engineers. When Campbell presented his sketch, the room's reaction was immediate and hostile. "That is completely illegal," stated Commander James, the senior flight operations specialist. His voice, calm and measured, carried the weight of unassailable doctrine. He cited the International Air Navigation Convention, which mandated that all flight operations align with a vessel's central axis. "This is an innovation, Captain," he concluded. "It's amateur nonsense." The condescension was palpable. James continued, outlining perceived aerodynamic folly. Pilots would be forced to land across the carrier's natural pitch and roll, constantly fighting unpredictable drift as the landing area moved beneath them in ways they couldn't anticipate. He predicted a sharp increase in crashes, not a reduction. As another officer began to speak, Lewis Boddington, the civilian engineer from Farnborough, held up his hand, cutting through the chorus of objections. "Show me the math," he said. Campbell blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The math," Boddington repeated, his gaze sweeping across the engineers. "You say pilots will fight drift. Calculate it. An 8-degree angle on a deck moving through 12-degree rolls. What's the differential drift over a 30-second approach?" A profound silence fell over the room. No one spoke. "Then we test it," Boddington declared. The solution began not with steel, but with paint. Drawing on experience with outline runways at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, a radical proposal emerged: to paint an angled deck directly onto HMS Triumph's existing flight deck for simulated approaches. The stakes were made clear in a terse exchange with Rear Admiral Slattery. He warned the project's champions, Lewis Boddington and Captain Dennis Campbell, that if pilots crashed, their careers would be forfeit. Boddington's reply was stark. If it worked, they would stop killing pilots who did everything right. The trials commenced in September 1951. HMS Triumph departed Portsmouth, her traditional axial deck marked with the ghostly white lines of a new geometry. For 3 weeks, Royal Navy pilots conducted touch-and-go landings, treating the painted line as a real deck edge. The predicted and much-feared drift problem proved to be a phantom. Pilots adapted to the new alignment within 2 landings. What they discovered was not a new danger, but an entirely new dimension of safety, freedom. Test pilot Lieutenant Peter Chilton captured the profound psychological impact. "I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career I wasn't terrified," he later wrote. "I just poured on power and climbed away. No barrier waiting to kill me, just clean air and a second chance." By October, the painted deck trials had unequivocally proven the concept viability. Now, the greater challenge was convincing the world's most powerful Navy. The carrier whose pilots were dying at twice the Royal Navy's rate was American, and the U.S. Navy was not accustomed to taking design advice from British officers. On September 14, 1951, at the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, that delicate task fell to one man. Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot and the most accomplished aviator in history, stood before 40 elite American pilots. He could feel their skepticism. He began not with schematics, but with their shared trauma. "Gentlemen," he asked, "in the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade?" Slowly, 15 hands were raised. "How many of you know someone who died hitting the barricade?" Every hand went up. After a moment of grim silence, Brown opened his briefcase, referencing the 63 successful landings he himself had already made on the test deck. He then pinned Campbell's diagram to the wall, revealing an aircraft carrier flight deck angled 8 degrees to port. The room immediately erupted in protest. The room erupted with a chorus of incredulous objections. How could the landing signal officer guide a plane in from the side? The proposed landing zone was dangerously close to the carrier's superstructure, the island. Commander Brown waited for the uproar to subside before delivering his transformative counterargument. He acknowledged every single objection as one his team had already considered and tested. The result, he explained, was simple and revolutionary. When a pilot misses the arrestor wires on an angled deck, the outcome isn't a fatal crash into parked aircraft. Instead, he can throttle up and simply go around for another attempt. This radical departure from tradition was too much for many in the room. Commander Harold Buell, the seasoned commanding officer of Squadron VF 84, stood to voice the deep-seated skepticism of the veteran aviators. "Commander Brown," he began, I've been landing on carriers since 1943. What you're describing violates every principle we've developed through 8 years of combat operations. You're asking us to throw away proven doctrine for a British theory. Brown's retort was swift, cutting to the heart of the crisis. I'm asking you to stop dying for a design flaw. The room fell silent. He pressed his advantage, articulating the fundamental mismatch plaguing naval aviation. Straight-deck carriers were designed for propeller planes like Corsairs and Hellcats, which could cut power and fall onto the deck. Modern jets, however, required a powered approach, making the old method obsolete and deadly. You're forcing 1952 aircraft into 1942 operations, Brown declared, and your people are dying because of it. The angled deck doesn't violate doctrine. It adapts the carrier to match the aircraft. As tensions mounted, Rear Admiral Apollo Susk, the senior U.S. Navy aviator in London, stepped forward. Having personally observed the British tests aboard HMS Triumph, he confirmed Brown's claims and revealed he had already recommended parallel trials on the USS Midway. But Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, chief of the powerful Bureau of Aeronautics, remained unconvinced, shaking his head. We're already testing solutions, he insisted. The Davis barrier has a 98.7% success rate. 98.7% of what? Brown interjected, challenging the statistics' very foundation. He reframed the debate from equipment performance to human survival. The Navy's data, he argued, ignored the pilots who panicked at the sight of the barrier, or those who deliberately ditched their multi-million-dollar aircraft in the ocean rather than risk a high-power impact. Your statistic measures barrier performance, he concluded. It doesn't measure pilot survival. The room once again erupted, this time divided between pilots nodding in agreement and those who looked ready to physically remove Brown. Admiral Susk raised his voice to restore order, making a final, decisive command. The angled deck will be tested on the USS Midway with painted lines and simulated landings. If successful, a full structural modification would follow. After a long, tense silence, Admiral Pride gave his reluctant authorization, but with severe ultimatum. If the British pipe dream caused a single additional casualty, he would terminate the program and careers of everyone associated with it. Admiral Susk simply nodded. Agreed. The future of naval aviation would now be decided at sea. The successful trial of a painted line on the USS Midway had proven the concept. Now, theory had to become steel. Within 90 days, the U.S. Navy had executed a radical alteration to the carrier USS Antietam, fabricating and welding a massive structure, a sponson, to its port side. This created the world's first truly angled flight deck, and on January 12, 1953, off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, its revolutionary design would be put to the ultimate test. In the cockpit of his F-9 F-5 Panther, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell banked into the landing pattern. Buell was a veteran, with 42 carrier landings in his logbook, but this 43rd approach was unlike any other. He was not aiming for a painted line. He was aiming for an 8-degree extension of the deck that defied every instinct he had honed for survival. For his entire career, the unforgiving geometry of the straight deck had presented two options: catch a wire or collide with a barricade. That brutal calculus had saved his life twice. Now, he was being told to trust in open air. Buell dropped his gear, adjusted trim, and called his position. Panther Ball 3.2. Roger Ball. The landing signal officer confirmed. The approach was flawless until a sudden gust of wind lifted his aircraft 6 feet high. On a conventional carrier, the LSO would have screamed for a wave-off, forcing Buell to abort. But today, the radio was silent. The angled deck transformed a potential disaster into a recoverable error. Buell pushed the Panther's nose down, bleeding off the excess altitude, but the correction made him long. He was going to miss the arresting gear. Aboard a straight-deck carrier, this was the moment of primal fear, where pilots made fatal overcorrections. Buell fought his instincts and held to the briefing. Asterisk if you miss, you climb. The deck is clear. Asterisk his wheels slammed down, bounced once, and his tailhook skipped uselessly over all 4 wires. Where the barricade should have been, there was nothing but runway and sky. Buell shoved the throttle to its stop. The J-48 engine took a full 6 seconds to spool to maximum power, an eternity that was now a gift of time. The Panther clawed back into the air. Just 23 seconds later, Buell was back in the pattern, and on his second approach, he caught the 3-wire for a perfect landing. Climbing from the cockpit, he was shaking not with fear, but with profound relief he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. As he would later write, to an experienced tail hooker, landing a jet airplane on an angled deck was sheer. For the pilots, the change was nothing short of a revelation. The constant, gnawing fear that accompanied every carrier approach, a psychological weight many didn't realize they carried until it was gone, was suddenly lifted. The proof was immediate and overwhelming. Over a 60-day trial period, Carrier Air Group 8 executed 1,327 landings on the USS Antietam's new angled deck. They recorded only 8 bolters, missed arresting wires that required to go around. On a traditional straight-deck carrier, those 8 errors could have easily resulted in 5 catastrophic barrier crashes, the loss of 2 aircraft, and the deaths of 1 or 2 pilots. On the angled deck, the outcome was starkly different. 0 crashes, 0 aircraft destroyed, and 0 injuries. The data, when scaled across the entire fleet, was undeniable. In the years just before the angled deck, from 1950 to 1952, U.S. Navy carrier aviation averaged 647 major mishaps per year, with landing accidents accounting for a staggering 52% of all losses. After its implementation, between 1955 and 1957, that yearly average plummeted to 321, and landing accidents were responsible for only 19% of losses. This amounted to a 75% reduction in landing accidents and an 80% drop in fatalities related to barrier crashes. But statistics alone cannot capture the human story. That story is best told by Lieutenant James Davidson. On March 8, 1953, Davidson was nursing his damaged Panther jet back to the Antietam. With a complete hydraulic failure and no flaps, his landing speed was a perilous 20 knots too fast. On a straight deck, his only option would have been to ditch in the ocean rather than risk a 145-knot impact with the barrier. But the Antietam gave him another choice. Davidson made 4 harrowing approaches, missing the wires each time. On his final attempt, he caught the 4th wire at 142 knots, the fastest successful carrier landing ever recorded to that point. His aircraft screeched to a halt with a mere 11 feet of deck to spare. 6 months later, he wrote to the angled deck's inventor, Captain Dennis Campbell. "Sir, I never met you, but I'm alive to write this letter because you had an idea everyone said was impossible. My daughter was born last month. I got be there because you refused to accept that good pilots should die for bad design." The world's navies took notice. The British implemented angled decks on the HMS Ark Royal in 1955. The French converted the Clemenceau, and the Australians modified the HMAS Melbourne. By 1957, every major aircraft carrier in the Western world was either built with an angled deck or being retrofitted. Even the Soviets, who initially rejected the concept, quietly implemented it on their carrier Variag in 1959 after a series of disastrous landing accidents. Soviet naval records, declassified in 1993, revealed their landing accidents dropped by 68% within 6 months. The most powerful testimony, however, comes from men like Captain John Moore, who flew combat missions over Vietnam. "I made 947 carrier landings between 1954 and 1973, he recalled. "I boltered 62 times. On a straight deck, that's 62 potential barrier crashes, 62 chances to die or kill the sailors on the deck. The revolution is complete when it becomes invisible. For a generation of pilots, the angle flight deck is not an innovation. It is simply the fundamental design of an aircraft carrier. Yet, for those who flew in the perilous straight-deck era of the 1950s, it represents a line between life and death, a line drawn on paper by Captain Dennis Campbell. His breakthrough would save thousands of lives, but the man himself systematically avoided the fame that came with it. Campbell never granted a press interview about his invention. Following his promotion to Rear Admiral in 1954, he attended the launch of HMS Ark Royal, the first carrier ever designed from the keel up with an angled deck. When approached by reporters, he redirected all inquiries to his colleagues, Louis Boddington, and the engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. The next year, in 1955, he received an invitation from the United States Navy for commissioning of the USS Forrestal, the first American supercarrier built with a full suite of modern technologies he helped pioneer. Campbell sent his regrets. He was attending the funeral of a Royal Navy lieutenant, a young man killed in a helicopter crash unrelated to Campbell's work, but who had served under his command back in 1943. For Campbell, the duty to one's people was absolute. In 1957, he was awarded the CBE Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his services to naval aviation. The official citation was a mere 2 sentences. Campbell filed it away in a drawer. After retiring from the Royal Navy in 1960, he joined Hawker Siddeley Aviation, lending his expertise to the development of vertical takeoff jets. There, his core principles remained unchanged. Engineer Anthony Marsh recalled how Campbell would slow every design review, obsessing over pilot safety. He'd ask questions like, "What happens if this fails at night in bad weather?" Marsh noted, "We'd tell him the odds of that failure were 1 in 10,000. He'd say, 'What does the pilot do when it happens?' He never cared about odds. He cared about the one pilot who got unlucky. When Captain Dennis Campbell died on April 6, 2000, his passing at the age of 92 was marked by modest obituaries. The Times of London devoted 4 paragraphs, The Guardian, 6. Both dutifully mention his invention, the angled flight deck, but neither captured profound significance, a legacy measured not in words, but in lives. Since 1953, every carrier landing has been a testament to his refusal to accept preventable death. Today, the fleets of every major naval power, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, and Russian, are built around his concept. Even the U.S. Navy's state-of-the-art Gerald R. Ford-class supercarriers, with their advanced electromagnetic catapults, still feature a flight deck angled at 8 degrees to port, the precise measurement Campbell first sketched in 1951. The scale of this achievement is staggering. In the U.S. Navy alone, pilots execute over 15,000 carrier landings annually. A typical bolter rate, where the arresting wires are missed, is 8%. This translates to 1,200 high-stakes approaches each year that, without the angled deck, would have been potential high-speed collisions with a barrier. Over 7 decades, the lives saved number in the tens of thousands. This impact was articulated perfectly by U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black, a veteran F/A-18 pilot. In 2003, he wrote to Campbell's family, "I never met your father, but I made 147 carrier landings. I boltered 142 times. On a straight deck, that's 142 times I might have died. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again. Your father gave me 142 second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life." Dennis Campbell had been dead 3 years when the letter arrived, but his son framed it, a tribute more meaningful than any official award his father never kept. It illuminates a fundamental truth. History-altering breakthroughs often come from outsiders. Captain Campbell was not an engineer or a test pilot. He was a naval bureaucrat, haunted by the memory of fallen colleagues, who possessed the audacity to challenge the status quo with a simple line on paper. His concept, born not in a laboratory but from a sketch in a notebook, saved more lives than any single Medal of Honor recipient. It stands as a timeless reminder that history is not always shaped by the highest ranks, but sometimes by the quiet resolve of an individual who refuses to accept that how we've always done it is a valid reason for good people to die.